Magnus Carlsen won the World Rapid Play Championship, and now they moved on to the World Blitz Championship. So this was played in two phases. First phase was 19 rounds of Blitz, and then the top four players would qualify for semi-finals and then a final. Now you can see that out on top was Arjun Erigaisi. So he scored pretty impressive 15 out of 19. And then came Fabiano Caruana. Magnus Carlsen, 13.5. Now he had to work very, very hard to get into the top four. He put together a string of wins on the second day and got there. And then Abdusattorov got there on tiebreak with 13. So that gave us semi-finals of Erigaisi against Abdusattorov and Carlsen against Caruana. Now, those four-game matches. Remember, time control is 3 minutes plus 2 seconds increment per move. And they were actually very, very clear-cut. Abdusattorov defeated Erigaisi, and then Carlsen defeated Caruana. Both very convincing. So we had a 4-game final between Magnus Carlsen and Nodibek Abdusattorov. So we've got really two different generations playing, which always makes life interesting. And if it was 2-2 at the end of 4 games, then it would go to an Armageddon game. But anyway, one step at a time, let's take a look at these games. Here is the first Blitz game. Magnus Carlsen playing white, Nodibek Abdusattorov black. And it's a Carlsen kind of position. Well, first, it's an end game. And we know how brilliantly Magnus plays these end games, particularly in fast time controls, actually, where he's so fluent. And he has a more comfortable position. You can see his pieces are very harmoniously placed. He's got his rook to the open file. Before black, it's white to play. There are a couple of little pawn weaknesses here, and perhaps an exposed 7th rank, but how does white actually make something of this? I mean, maybe you'd like to have a little think. How do you play this as white? It's not absolutely obvious how to make progress. Now, I thought Carlsen's decision here was brilliant, actually. Now, you could just shuffle your king into the middle. You could play a4 to secure the knight on this excellent square. These are reasonable moves. But Carlsen played bishop takes knight. Now, at first glance, a very unexpected decision, giving away this beautiful bishop. However, what you're left with is a very pleasant knight on c4 against a bishop which isn't so great on c5. Now, the first thing is that, black would like to keep a regular pawn structure, but after rook takes, white exploits the pin here and wins a pawn. So black has to recapture with the pawn, so those pawns aren't so pretty. Now, I would like to be able to play the rook to the 7th rank, but okay, the boot is on the other foot now. Bishop takes a3. In this case, black exploits the pin, and I should say split rooks. That's the problem. And again, in that position, in that other position, that's also a case of the disadvantage of the split rooks. So instead, Carlsen just shuffled his king to the middle. Now that gave Abdusattorov a chance to play his rook to the middle, but Carlsen simply exchanged and put the king on e2. So the king is beautifully placed, controlling entry squares for the rook, black's rook, and then white is free to operate with the rook and knight. So king f8, yep, that king should come to the middle. Rook c2. A little bit of shuffling going on here. Rook d5. a4. So that secures the knight on c4, fixes the pawn on b6. King e7, and also frees the knight for action. So knight b2. So that knight is swinging around here and maybe into f4, but also it leaves the path open for the rook. Now, I don't want to sort of delve too deeply into this, otherwise we won't get through the entire match, but I like knight d3 in this position, and then knight f4, which puts some pressure on the rook and starts to hit that weak e-pawn as well. But Carlsen played more directly. As is his wont, he saw this excellent idea of shifting the rook over to h4. And that means the bishop has to retreat in order to defend that pawn with h6. So knight d3. And now b5, Abdusattorov finds counterplay. I think this is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, you know, there's tricky stuff going on the king side. Rook h4 and knight f4. Okay, so some interesting holes around here for that knight to hop into. Hits the rook as well. And now Carlsen's next move I found really unexpected. Well, I didn't expect it anyway. Knight g6. So, you know, you might think the knight sort of belongs more on h5. But it's a very clever idea. He must have seen that after... Well, first, the bishop is attacked, of course. And if black plays, let's say, normally with bishop g7, then rook d4 check. And that puts the king in a very uncomfortable situation. So if it moves away here, that knight can swing back to hit the e-pawn. If king e8, then the rook comes in. And those pawns are in trouble. The rook is beautifully placed. The bishop is terrible. But Abdusattorov found a brilliant move. Bishop d6. He's prepared to give up the rook's pawn, but it means his bishop is beautifully placed here and controls the knight, and the knight isn't so well placed. And here, obviously, the rook is finding counterplay. I think it's probably best just to shuffle the king back. And after this, yeah, black is going to take here, but, well, it's a very double-edged position, but the computer says equal. I mean, anything could still happen here. But Carlsen instead makes an outrageous attempt to play for a win. He plays king d3. I mean, this is quite extraordinary because now his pawns are really messed up, but, well, he went for it. Took on b5, rook takes g2. I mean, you can see white's pawns are a mess, and black has this lovely clump of central pawns. However, it's tempting. You know, Carlsen has created two passed pawns. Now, if I analyse this too deeply, we'll never get to see any other games, but there are lots of inaccuracies. But I think one crucial thing is that Abdusattorov was ahead on time. Carlsen had run really low on time. And Abdusattorov found a clear plan, basically to bring the king up the board, take the pawn, and take on b3. And this basically completely discombobulated Carlsen. It's not so easy for him to push this pawn down the board because the rook is active. Now he checked. And then Carlsen picked up the rook, wanting to play the rook to f7. Realised the knight was would be on prise. And then had to just put the rook back to h6 to defend the knight. Obviously a mistake. I should say that in this position, if the knight comes back, then black will take and it should be a draw. But Carlsen played here. Obviously he's lost a lot of time, and this is now very scary. And the game went like this. h5, Carlsen looking for counterplay, but you can see the rook is in the wrong position. So he moves it away. King takes b3. Rook d8, that's the final blunder. He could still bring the knight back and hope to make a draw. But after this, bishop b4. And that is a clean knockout because rook d2, mate is threatened and there is no sensible way out. I mean, you can play e4, but then the rook is gone on d8. And so after bishop b4, Carlsen resigned. What a turnaround. I thought Abdusattorov handled a difficult endgame very well indeed. First, finding counterplay with rook d5 and then b5 later on. And then that very cool move, bishop d6, allowing the pawn to be taken but finding counterplay with the rook. And Carlsen was completely phased. He could have played pragmatically, bringing the king back, but went for it with king d3 and lost the plot. So, game 1 went to Noribek Abdusattorov. Okay, let's move to game 2. And, well, a fairly... well, a tense middle game, but basically they reached an end game that somehow Carlsen managed to make some progress. So they reached this position. Now you can see very few pawns on the board, but Carlsen has a bit of space. And, well, this is still okay for white. If the king drops back, I mean, this looks incredibly scary with the king coming over, but, well, the computer tells me that this is still okay for white after knight f5, but by this stage Abdusattorov under massive pressure, and he played king e2, obviously scared about the king coming in, and Carlsen played king c3, and suddenly he's winning. But there's a very nice little idea. Let's just see this. Knight f5. King takes c2. The b pawn is going to be too strong. Knight d4 check. So the knight is buzzing around. And now Abdusattorov tries his last chance. He brings the king and he wants to move towards the h pawn. Give up the knight for the pawn and move the king in. So how are you going to defend this? Let's take a look. I think we might have to have a think and drink moment. King e4. Okay, so it's Carlsen to play in this position. How should black play here? I'll have a drink, you have a think. See you in a moment.
I've seen many chessboards in my life, but when I heard about this one, I was keen to see it for myself. It's beautiful and completely wireless, thanks to an integrated battery and Bluetooth connection. For my edition, I wanted pieces that reflect clarity. When I play with them, everything feels natural. Just me, the board, and the game I love. This is my supreme chess set, the Daniel King edition.
What did you come up with here? Somehow you have to secure these kingside pawns, and you can only do it with the knight. So Carlsen managed to do that with knight g6, and after this, knight h4. Okay, the pawn advances, so basically black is going to win the knight. Let's just see that. There we go. But against this formation, with the knight on f3 defending the pawn and covering the h4 square, white could do absolutely nothing. It's a fortress, basically. I mean, the king came back, and yeah, if king e4, then just knight h4, And you can see white's king gets absolutely nowhere. These squares are covered and the black king will come in here. So Abdusattorov tried one last trick, h4. So if knight takes, then king takes, g takes h4, and king f4. Now you still got to be careful here. But Carlsen found the best way. Knight g5, cool move. So if that's taken, then the pawn runs towards the queening square, and otherwise the pawn is going to be protected on h3 and game over. So Carlsen hit back and won game 2. Right, let's move on. Let's have a look at game 3. So this was a Jabava London system that reached a pawn structure that Carlsen is very familiar with and likes very much. You also get this from the Caro-Kann exchange variation, where you have these pawns here, this fixed pawn structure. Carlsen loves fixed pawn structures. That enables him to maneuver his pieces. But Abdusattorov had reacted pretty well, finding counterplay by creating space on the king side with the h-pawn. And here he has to react against this pawn advance. Now if you play b5, this is risky because that knight could well hop in to c5. If you remember Ding against Nepo, their World Championship match, Ding played a brilliant game with a similar kind of idea, similar pieces. But Abdusattorov took on a5 and played bishop b5. Okay, this is good. So the pressure is off the pawn on a6, and the bishop on d3 is an excellent piece. So this exchanges off this bad bishop. Now Carlsen tried a similar maneuver, the one I just mentioned. So he wants to bring his knight to this excellent square on d3 and possibly into here, possibly into e5. But again, Abdusattorov found good counterplay, bringing the knight to f4. Carlsen exchanged, played the knight to d3 and knight f4. And this piece is simply too dangerous. So Carlsen had to exchange that off. So the queen is nice and active. But Carlsen's still hoping to press against that weak pawn. g6, this is a good idea. Carlsen took the open file. King g7, very cool move. Queen d5, so is Carlsen somehow trying to creep into this position? Well, I think black can defend this in a couple of ways, but Abdusattorov basically shut the game down with his next move, an excellent move. Rook a8. So the rook does not want to leave the open file. That's too dangerous. You don't want to lose the initiative. So Carlsen decided, right, I'm going to be pragmatic this time. And he just took the rook. And Abdusattorov played the check, and this is just a draw by perpetual check. Or repetition, whichever way you want to look at it. And so on. Neat tactic from Abdusattorov to just kill the game and force a draw basically after this. So that was the final position. They agreed to draw. So 1/2 after 3 games. So they went into game 4. Remember, if it's a draw, then they would go to Armageddon. Now this was an incredibly tense game. Magnus had to weather a lot of pressure with black, but finally he managed to emerge into an endgame where he had an extra pawn. But winning this one was always going to be a tall order. If you exchange bishops, most of these endgames with rook and 4 against rook and 3 on one side are a draw, and the bishop endgame should also be a draw. let's see how it went in practice. So, well, first of all, Magnus is still trying very hard. Bishop d4. Now, in this case, the rook and pawn endgame would be winning for black because you can, because you can recapture with the pawn. The passed pawn is just too strong in this case. So Abdusattorov had to avoid the exchange and move the bishop down to h6. Okay, king d3, rook a3 check. So if the king comes forward, you can check it away. So Carlsen offered an exchange of rooks. Well, you could go active, but after this, well, this is tricky. You know, if this one caves in, then white could be in trouble. So Abdusattorov, I think quite correctly, exchanged rooks and played bishop g7, e4, king f1, king d3. Now, I mean, this should really be a draw. I mean, one of the reasons is that if pawns get exchanged, and then in some cases white can even give up the bishop because it's the wrong colour bishop for that rook's pawn. Now let me see, bishop h6. Yeah, if e3 here, you can take and play the bishop back to g7, and the king protects this pawn with king g2, it's no problem. Carlsen played bishop e5. Now, suddenly it's a little tricky. If bishop g7, e3 takes, bishop takes g3, in fact this is still a draw because white's king gets to h3 just in time to prevent king g4. Bishop g7 is the best move. But Abdusattorov, down to his final few seconds, played bishop c1. Didn't look like a big deal. Again, Carlsen, very little time on his clock, but he found e3. It's a brilliant move. So unexpected. In this seemingly barren position, Carlsen finds an idea. Finds a little trick. Now, if pawn takes, bishop takes g3, this pawn drops. 2 pawns, too much. So bishop takes e3 played. Then bishop takes g3, threatening to take a second pawn. Now, if pawn takes bishop, king takes, the pawn endgame is winning for black. You can still mess this up if you play g5, then g4 is a very cool move, a known kind of idea, but f5, and basically you just squeeze the king out, and you play f4. Okay, simple stuff. King g4. So basically, black is losing a second pawn here. Abdusattorov, in desperation, played bishop g5, and Carlsen just took it. And Abdusattorov resigned because if pawn takes, then, well, okay, you can do this basically and win this pawn. I'm sure you know this very well. Basically, the king gets squeezed out. King takes g3. It's going to happen. Okay, I'll play it out like this, and black wins. So yeah, that's where Abdusattorov resigned. So Magnus Carlsen is World Blitz champion again. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. That is his 9th World Blitz title, and again he is double world champion in Blitz and Rapid. It's incredible how, you know, he manages to pull things out of the bag, you know, when it really counts. You know, in that final day, to get through to the final four, then he really had to put a string of wins together, and he managed it. And it was incredible that, having lost that first game in this final, he showed such spirit to come back and win. As I said, it's his 9th World Blitz title. It's absolutely staggering. Well done to him.